My name is Claire. I'm 30 years old, and last week my mother called me in tears for the first time in my life. She needs a caregiver now. Before she even finished asking, I already knew the exact 4 words I was going to say. 2 years ago, I was the one crying. At 28, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer, and my mother answered me with a single sentence I'll never forget. 6 months of chemotherapy, 36 appointments, not one visit from my family. They were too busy planning my sister's wedding. But here's the part none of them ever bothered to find out. While I was losing my hair, my mother was quietly signing paperwork that put my sister's name where mine never would have been. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where we tell quiet stories about people who finally stop apologizing for taking up space. If you've ever been the family member everyone expects to sacrifice, this story is for you. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is, and don't forget to subscribe. Now let me take you back 2 years, to a Tuesday afternoon and a phone call from my doctor. Before that call, my life looked stable from the outside. I worked as a paralegal at a small elder law firm in Pittsburgh, preparing Medicaid applications and reviewing other people's property deeds all day. I was good at my job. I stayed late because the work made sense in a way my family never did. Numbers always balanced, rules applied equally to everyone. I owned a 1-bedroom condo I'd bought on my own, treated my coffee maker like it was priceless, and had built a reputation for being the person who always handled everything. I scheduled my mother's eye appointments. I filed my sister's taxes every April without charging her a dime. Whenever something went wrong in my family, my phone rang. Mine was always the number people called, never the other way around. The few friends I kept described me as dependable, which is really just a polite way of saying I was a woman who didn't know how to say no. I convinced myself that was a strength. I was the one who read every line of the fine print, the one who understood that transferring a house to a child could quietly destroy a parent's ability to qualify for long-term care later. Clients thanked me while their relatives stood around looking completely lost. Never once did I imagine I'd someday pull up county property records and find my own mother's name staring back at me. That afternoon, I was in the back office sorting through a stack of nursing home invoices for a client when my cell phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered out of the same instinct that had guided my entire life, the need to make sure nothing was left unresolved. A nurse said my name, then told me my doctor wanted me to come in the following morning. People don't schedule appointments for the next morning to deliver good news. After she hung up, I sat there staring at those invoices for a long time. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand what my family was like. My father died when I was 12. After that, my mother, Karen, ran our household like someone protecting the last lifeboat on Earth. There was always just enough. And somehow, it always went to my sister. Emily is 4 years younger than I am. She was the sensitive one, the daughter who cried easily and was always comforted for it. When Emily wanted to go to college, my mother wrote the tuition checks. When I wanted to go, I took out student loans and was told the debt would build character. By the time I turned 28, I'd nearly finished paying them off. Emily had her degree, a fiancé, and a wedding budget that somehow grew larger every month. None of this was hidden. Every Sunday at dinner, my mother stood over her faded blue Pyrex dish filled with pot roast, the same chipped casserole dish she'd been using since I was a child, and repeated the same sentence. "This house," she'd say, "stays in the family, the real family. You understand." I understood perfectly. The real family consisted of husbands and grandchildren who hadn't even been born yet. I was simply the extra pair of hands. The daughter who would always have time because I hadn't filled my life with the right people. My mother believed that as naturally as some people believe tomorrow's weather forecast. She had watched her own mother be cared for by an unmarried sister who gave up everything in her mind. That's simply how life worked. The married daughter inherited the house. The single daughter kept her calendar open. I'd heard that speech so many times it barely registered anymore. What I didn't know on that Tuesday night was how soon both of those roles would be put to the test, and how quickly my mother would forget which daughter she was really going to need. The next morning, my doctor didn't soften the news. "Stage 3, she said. "Hodgkin lymphoma. It's highly treatable, but we can't afford to wait. We start chemotherapy in 2 weeks." I sat there in that small exam room and did what I've always done. I got to work inside my own head. I asked about the treatment protocol. I asked how many chemotherapy cycles I'd need. I asked how much I'd be responsible for paying after insurance, because I'd seen enough clients blindsided by coverage gaps to know those gaps were exactly where families fell apart. She wrote the numbers on a notepad. I typed every one of them into my phone as if I were taking notes for someone else's case. I didn't cry. Crying had never really been an option for me. In my family, my emotions were always expected to wait until someone else's bigger moment had passed. I walked out to the parking garage, found my car on the 3rd level, and sat behind the steering wheel with my hands resting at 10 and 2 as though I were about to drive away. I wasn't going anywhere. I just sat there breathing, counting the concrete support columns, trying to calculate how one person survives something like this alone. Then I did what every part of me, even the rational part, still instinctively wanted to do. I scrolled to the contact labeled Mom. My thumb hovered over her name. I told myself she was my mother, that this was the one thing too overwhelming to face by myself. I convinced myself that surely a cancer diagnosis was the one line she would never cross. I want you to understand something. I wasn't naive. I just wanted, just once, to be wrong about her. I pressed the green call button. It rang twice. She answered sounding distracted, laughing at something in the background before asking what I needed, because whenever I called, there was always a reason. I told her as plainly as I could, "Mom, I have cancer, stage 3. I start chemotherapy in 2 weeks. I'm scared, and I don't want to go through this alone." Silence filled the line. During that pause, I could hear my sister in the background asking about ribbon colors. My mother sighed the same way she always did whenever I presented her with an inconvenience. Then she said the sentence that still echoes in my head exactly as she spoke it. "We can't deal with this right now," she said. "Your sister is planning her wedding." I waited. I kept waiting for the rest. For, "Of course we'll be there," or "Send me your treatment schedule," or even, "I'm so sorry," instead. She filled the silence with wedding logistics. The ceremony was only 4 months away. There was the venue, the dress, Emily's anxiety. "You've always been the strong one," she told me. "You'll figure it out. You don't need us hovering over you." I heard her cover the phone and tell Emily she'd be right there. Then, almost gently, she delivered the sentence that completely shattered me. "Try not to upset your sister with this," she said. "She's already under so much stress," I answered. "Okay." That's the part that hurts the most when I look back. I said okay in my normal voice, as if she'd simply asked me to pick up napkins on the way home. Then we hung up. I sat alone in my car inside that dark parking garage and finally understood something with complete clarity. There had never been a line she wouldn't cross. There had only ever been a calendar, and my illness had simply happened to fall on an inconvenient date. I didn't call my mother again for a long time. Instead, I started watching. The way you watch the weather after you've stopped trusting the forecast, waiting for the day everything would eventually come back around. A few days later, I tried reaching out in a different direction. I texted Emily. I kept the message careful and small, the way you speak to someone you're afraid of needing. I told her about my diagnosis. Then I asked if she'd come with me to my first chemotherapy appointment so I wouldn't have to walk in alone. I watched the typing bubbles appear, disappear, then return again. Nearly an hour passed before her reply finally came. Most of it was about alterations for her wedding dress. Then came the sentence I'd carry around for the next 2 years like a pebble trapped inside my shoe. "You don't even have a family of your own. Claire," she wrote, "you have time for this kind of stuff. I don't." I read the message 4 times, searching for the place where she'd misunderstood me. There wasn't one. To my sister, the fact that I was single and didn't have children wasn't simply part of my life. It was a resource the rest of the family believed they could spend. My empty calendar belonged to them. Her full calendar was sacred. I called my mother one more time, hoping she'd at least be embarrassed by what Emily had written. Instead, she immediately took Emily's side. She spoke gently, almost patiently, as though she were explaining something obvious to a child who simply wasn't bright enough to understand. "It's not like you have a husband waiting for you at home," she said. "Emily needs our support right now." The way they kept saying support, as though Emily were the one walking into a room every 2 weeks to have poison pumped into her body. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there in silence. Something inside me became very quiet that day. Not broken, just quiet. The way a house sounds after the last guest finally leaves. From that moment on, I stopped asking. I'd ask the universe for help before I'd ever ask either of them again. As it turned out, the universe answered with a retired school teacher named Margaret. 2 weeks later, I drove myself to my first chemotherapy infusion. The treatment center was on the 4th floor. It was a long room lined with reclining chairs arranged in a wide semicircle. Beside every chair stood an IV pole like a silent companion. I checked in, rolled up my sleeve, and watched a nurse hang the first bag of medication. She must have noticed I was sitting there completely alone because she came back a few minutes later carrying a folded blanket. Without saying anything, she spread it gently across my lap. It was a standard hospital fleece blanket in a soft teal color. The edges were worn smooth and covered with tiny pills from being washed hundreds of times. It wasn't mine. There was nothing special about it. But that blanket was the only thing inside that building that touched me with genuine kindness that entire day. I held onto it as though it were. Of course I had brought my laptop. I answered client emails throughout the first hour, drafting a Medicaid benefits application while chemotherapy drugs slowly dripped into my bloodstream. Around me, every other chair had someone sitting beside it. One husband read crossword clues out loud. A grown son read the sports section to his mother. A young couple shared a pair of earbuds, watching something together on a single screen with their heads leaning toward each other. I counted 19 treatment chairs, 18 companions. Then there was me, and a borrowed teal blanket that somehow gave me just enough grounding to stay present inside my own body. When the infusion ended, the nurse asked if someone was coming to pick me up. I smiled and told her I was fine to drive. It was a lie. I drove myself home anyway, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The radio turned completely off. At my next treatment, I folded the blanket neatly and tried to return it. I felt guilty for keeping something that wasn't mine. The visit after that, the nurse simply smiled and told me to keep it. I still have that blanket today. Sunday family dinners continued without me. Of course, they had always been the center of my mother's world. Now they revolved entirely around the wedding. Every Monday morning, I'd see proof of it in the family group chat. A picture of the old blue Pyrex casserole dish steaming on the counter. A caption that said something like, "Wish you were here, sweetheart," never once accompanied by an actual invitation. Never an offer to pick me up. Never anyone asking if I wanted them to bring me a plate. That casserole dish had fed me throughout my childhood. Now it appeared in photographs of a table where my chair had quietly disappeared. Eventually, I learned not to open the family chat on Monday mornings. Meanwhile, the medical bills began arriving exactly the way they always do. Plain white envelopes carrying quiet violence inside, even after insurance. My share totaled just under $38,000. I sold the small amount of stock I'd managed to save. I canceled every subscription. I lived off whatever food was already in my pantry. Everything else went onto a payment plan that would follow me for years. By the third month, money became painfully tight. For the first time, I broke one of my own rules and asked my mother if she could lend me just a few $1,000s until an insurance reimbursement arrived. She replied almost immediately. "We just made the deposit on Emily's wedding venue," she said. "There's nothing left over right now. You'll manage. You always do." I didn't argue by then. Arguing felt like knocking on a door I already knew would never open, but I noticed the order of things. I always noticed the fine print. A deposit for a wedding celebration came first. My survival came second, and not by a small margin. I quietly filed that fact away the same way I file everything else, carefully, dated, stored away in case it ever became important. It would end up mattering far more than I ever could have imagined. The final straw during that first year came in October, just 1 week before the wedding. By then, I'd lost most of my hair. I wore a soft knit cap I'd ordered online. Against my better judgment, I decided I would still go. I told myself I'd simply sit in the back. I told myself I'd just be there, the way a sister should. Then my mother called. Her voice had that careful, reasonable tone she always used whenever she was about to ask for something completely unforgivable. She told me it might be better if I didn't come. She said I looked unwell. She said the wedding photographs would last forever. She said she didn't want anything to pull attention away from Emily on her special day. She actually used the phrase, pull attention, as though I were a stain on a tablecloth she'd noticed just in time. I stood there holding my phone, staring at my reflection in the hallway mirror, thin, pale, bald beneath a soft cotton cap, a woman fighting for her life. And I listened as my own mother asked me to spare the family from having to look at me. I said, "Okay." One more okay. Then I hung up. I didn't cry. That surprised me because I thought I would. Instead, I felt the last warm part of me turn cool and steady, like a thermostat quietly clicking off. That was the day I stopped waiting for them. I stopped checking my phone, hoping for a change of heart that was never coming. I finally understood that in my family. My pain would always be scheduled around someone else's celebration, and a person can only learn that lesson so many times before she stops enrolling in the class. What I didn't know, sitting alone in my quiet condo with that borrowed teal blanket draped across the couch, was that the waiting wasn't over. It was simply about to change direction, and this time it was heading straight toward me. Margaret Lawson began sitting in the recliner beside mine that November. She was a retired high school English teacher with a colorful silk scarf tied over her thinning hair and a thermos she stubbornly refused to explain. She watched me spend an entire infusion answering work emails before leaning over and saying, "You know, in my classroom we had a rule that nobody should answer email while being poisoned. It sets a terrible precedent." I laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. After that, she somehow always managed to schedule her treatments so they overlapped with mine. She never admitted she'd done it on purpose. She simply arrived carrying an extra cup so we could share whatever was inside her thermos. It turned out to be incredibly strong ginger tea. It eased my nausea better than anything my doctors prescribed. She had been widowed for 9 years. Her only son lived 3 time zones away and called every Sunday. Somewhere along the way, she'd decided loneliness was a problem you solved by quietly adopting whoever happened to be sitting beside you. One afternoon she asked, without ceremony, who was driving me home. I gave her my usual answer. "I'm fine." She looked at me the way every truly great teacher eventually does. The look that says, "I can see the assignment you never turned in." "Family is just the people who keep showing up," she said as she stirred her tea. "The rest is paperwork." I almost laughed and told her paperwork was my entire profession. Instead, I let her drive me home. She became the first person to do that. I sat quietly in the passenger seat with the teal blanket folded across my lap and experienced something I hadn't felt in months. The relief of not being responsible for everything. I had no idea how much I would eventually need her. The wedding happened without me, exactly as everyone had planned. I experienced it the same way I experienced most family events now, secondhand. Scrolling through pictures a cousin had posted online before someone remembered to make the album private. There was my mother wearing lavender, dabbing tears from her eyes. There was Emily glowing in gold beside her new husband, Nathan, his hand resting gently against her back. There was the entire real family gathered together on a perfectly manicured lawn beneath my mother's caption, "The happiest day of our lives." I looked at the pictures once, then I closed the app and went back to work, because work was still the only place where numbers behaved the way they were supposed to. That same week, what I would later stop believing was merely coincidence, Evelyn Parker, the attorney I worked for, handed me a new case. Evelyn was in her 50s, razor sharp, and impossible to fool. The file belonged to a man in his 70s who had transferred ownership of his home to his son to protect it. Now he needed nursing home care he couldn't qualify for. Evelyn walked me through the trap. "People think giving away the house protects it," she said, tapping the property deed. "Most of the time, it just destroys the Medicaid calculation." She explained the 5-year look-back period, how the state reviews every property transfer made for less than fair market value, how the penalty divisor converts those gifts into months and sometimes years of Medicaid ineligibility. I learned that transferring a house too late doesn't protect the parent. It leaves them stranded. I learned the exact math behind it. The kind of calculation you could work out on the back of a napkin once you understood the divisor. I quietly stored all of it away in the part of my mind reserved for useful information, never once imagining I'd eventually perform those calculations using my own mother's records. That evening, I drove home past the church where my sister had been married only days earlier. I didn't even slow down. The hardest night came after my 4th round of chemotherapy. By then, the accumulated weight of everything had finally crushed me. The nausea came in relentless waves that never fully passed. My bones ached so deeply it felt like my own skin had become a coat 2 sizes too small. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I called my mother, not because I expected her to answer, because 2 in the morning strips away every layer of adulthood until all that's left are your oldest instincts. Mine still reached for my mother in the dark. The phone rang. And rang, then went straight to a full voicemail box. Later, I realized it was full because she'd been leaving messages for caterers and honeymoon travel agents about Emily's wedding trip. I called again. Same result. I lay on the bathroom floor, wrapped in my teal blanket. By then, it had stopped being something I'd borrowed from the hospital. It had become mine, the way the only dependable thing in a terrible year eventually does. Then I sent Margaret a text containing just 3 words. "I'm not okay." 40 minutes later, she let herself into my condo, using the spare key I'd given her months earlier without either of us admitting exactly why. She didn't ask questions. She didn't make speeches. She simply sat beside me on the cold tile floor. She held the wastebasket while I was sick, softly recited a poem under her breath, stayed there until the worst of it passed. Near dawn, I finally fell asleep with my head resting against her shoulder. My mother returned my call the next morning at a perfectly civilized hour. She sounded cheerful, asked whether everything was okay. She'd been overwhelmed with honeymoon planning. I told her it was nothing. By then, I'd learned that anything I entrusted to her would eventually be set down somewhere and forgotten. From that day forward, I stopped calling people who only answered the phone for emergencies that weren't mine. The list of people I would call at 2 o'clock in the morning had narrowed to exactly 1. She didn't share a single drop of my blood. That turned out to be the most important calculation of all. If you're watching this and someone immediately came to mind, someone who only calls when they need something, Then you already understand exactly how my heart felt during that year. I'm not telling you to become bitter. I'm telling you to notice who answers the phone at 2 in the morning. That's your real family, whether you're related by blood or not. Stay with me, because the part where the paperwork starts telling the truth is coming next. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. A few weeks later, my mother called for one of her rare, dutiful check-ins, the kind where she spent 10 minutes talking about Emily's wonderful new married life before asking a single polite question about my treatment near the end of the conversation. Almost like leaving a tip on the table before walking away. I probably would have let the conversation pass like all the others if it hadn't been for one thing. My mother said almost in passing. It lodged itself inside me like a splinter. She told me not to worry about the house. The thing was, I hadn't even mentioned the house. There was a brief silence while I tried to understand why she'd brought it up. Then she continued in that calm, reasonable voice she always used when she was trying to smooth something over. "It's all taken care of," she said. "I made sure it stays where it belongs, with the family, so you don't have to think about any of it." I asked her what she meant by taken care of. Immediately. She became vague. She only got vague when she'd done something she didn't want examined. A second later, she'd already changed the subject, talking instead about Emily's kitchen renovation. But I recognized that tone. I'd heard it across conference tables hundreds of times from clients describing property transfers they only half understood and almost always regretted. Where it belongs, with the family, the real family. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone while that splinter worked itself even deeper in my profession. The phrase "it's taken care of" almost always means there's a legal document somewhere, one with consequences no one bothered to read carefully. And when it comes to deciding who owns a house, there's really only one type of document that matters. Once it's signed, there's only one place it ends up. I knew exactly where that place was. I searched those records for clients almost every single week. It had simply never occurred to me to type my own mother's address into the search box. That night, I couldn't stop thinking maybe I should. For 3 days, I argued with myself. Looking up my mother's property records felt strangely personal, almost like reading someone's diary, even though I knew better than anyone that a recorded deed is one of the least private documents a person can own. Property records are public by design. The entire system depends on anyone being able to verify ownership, so no one can secretly sell property out from under a buyer or a bank. One evening, I explained all of this to Margaret over the phone, mostly because I was trying to convince myself not to do it. She listened patiently, exactly the way she always did. Finally, she said, "Claire, it's public information. You're allowed to read public records. That's not snooping. That's simply being literate." Something about how plainly she said it broke through all my hesitation. I'd spent my entire life treating my mother's decisions like the weather, unpredictable, beyond my control, something that simply happened to me. But a deed isn't weather. A deed is a fact. It has a date, a filing stamp, a permanent public record. Anyone with an address and enough patience to type it into a search bar can find it. The following afternoon, during my lunch break, I opened the county recorder's website I'd used dozens of times for clients. For the very first time, I entered the address of the house where I'd grown up. My hand wasn't steady. That annoyed me because I'd typed hundreds of strangers' addresses into that exact same search field without a second thought. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe my mother had refinanced the mortgage. Maybe someone had corrected a spelling error. Just the ordinary movement of property records. I told myself she couldn't possibly have done the exact thing I'd spent my entire career warning families against. I pressed enter. The loading wheel spun for a few seconds. Then the newest recorded document appeared. It had been filed 8 months earlier, right in the middle of my chemotherapy. It was a quitclaim deed. Grantor, Karen M. Brooks. Grantee, Emily A. Brooks. My sister's maiden name. The document had been recorded just 3 weeks before her wedding. Consideration, $1. I read it 4 times, exactly the way I'd read Emily's text message months earlier, searching desperately for the misunderstanding. There wasn't one. My mother had transferred the house, the entire house, the same house she'd always insisted would stay in the family. She'd signed it over to my sister for $1 8 months into my cancer treatment. She'd done it during the same season she told me there wasn't enough money to help pay my medical bills. She'd done it while I lay on a bathroom floor wrapped in a borrowed blanket asking the darkness for help. I printed the deed. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe some instinct wanted the facts to become tangible, to hold the date in my own hands. The office printer quietly hummed. A few seconds later, I picked up the recorded deed, folded it neatly once, slipped it into a manila folder, exactly the way I'd done for hundreds of clients over the years. That was the moment my profession and my grief finally shook hands, because the instant I saw that $1 transfer, the trained part of my brain automatically started doing the math. 8 months ago, squarely inside the 5-year Medicaid look-back period, which meant that if my mother ever needed nursing home care, that house, the one she'd transferred to my sister for $1, wouldn't protect her. It would trap her, exactly the way it had trapped the elderly man in Evelyn Parker's case file. She could become ineligible for Medicaid benefits for months, possibly even years. Someone would have to pay privately while desperately trying to undo the damage. I stood beside the printer holding physical proof of exactly how little I'd mattered, beneath all the hurt. Another realization settled quietly into place, cold, clear, final. They hadn't simply abandoned me. They had quietly moved every meaningful asset beyond my reach, behind my back, and someday, that decision would come due. I'd like to tell you I called my mother that night and confronted her. I didn't. Instead, I sat alone at my kitchen table with the folded deed in front of me. The teal blanket covered my knees. I thought carefully about what confronting her would actually accomplish. A fight. Tears. Her tears. Carefully performed. Emily rallying the rest of the family by insisting I was jealous, bitter, and had always been that way. My mother casting herself as the victim. The poor elderly woman being attacked by her own daughter over a house. I'd gain absolutely nothing except more proof in their eyes that I was the difficult daughter, so I chose the harder path. I did nothing. I placed the deed inside a folder labeled with my mother's address, filed it exactly the way I would any client's documents. Then I put it in the same drawer where I kept all of my own important papers. It wasn't a secret. That thought steadied me. Secrets are things people hide. This wasn't hidden. It was a public record. I'd simply chosen to read it. The county had already stamped it, recorded it, made it permanent. Whether I confronted anyone or not changed absolutely nothing. Margaret came over that weekend. I handed her the deed. She read every page carefully, folded it back up, returned it to me. Then she quietly said, "Knowing is enough for now. You don't have to do anything with this today. You simply don't have to pretend anymore." Oddly enough, that turned out to be the greatest gift she could have given me. From that day forward, I stopped wondering whether my mother actually loved me and was simply terrible at showing it. The deed answered that question once and for all. You don't transfer your entire home to one daughter for a single dollar. While telling the other daughter there's nothing left to spare, I went back to the only project that still made sense, getting better, building a life my family would never truly know. The document sitting in my drawer could wait. Facts are patient like that. My final chemotherapy infusion came in the spring. A few weeks later, my scans came back clear for the first time. No evidence of disease. My oncologist said it carefully, the way doctors always do, letting the word remission carry most of the weight. Margaret, on the other hand, let out a triumphant cheer right there in the exam room. She even convinced the nurse to hug me. for one afternoon. I allowed myself to believe it. I'd survived the very thing my family couldn't be bothered to watch me survive. Then I did what I've always done. I went back to work rebuilding the structure of my life. I refinanced my medical debt and folded it into payments I could actually manage. At night, I started studying for my certified Medicaid planner credential. If I was going to spend my career helping families navigate this system, I wanted the letters after my name that made people trust my advice. Eventually, I received a small raise. Almost all of it went toward paying down my loans. I learned how to cook the few meals my stomach had tolerated during chemotherapy. Then I kept cooking them long after treatment ended, just to prove to myself that I could still take care of my own body. None of it was dramatic. That was exactly the point. While my family probably imagined me, if they thought about me at all, as the lonely single daughter drowning in medical bills, I was quietly, methodically learning how to stay afloat. I never told them any of it. There was no reason to. The less they knew about my real life, the more wrong their assumptions would eventually become. I didn't have a master plan. Not exactly. I simply had a clean scan, a shrinking debt, a professional certification on the horizon, a friend who answered the phone at 2 a.m, and a folded property deed sitting inside a drawer, as it turned out. That wasn't nothing. It was almost everything. 2 years passed, the way years always do once you stop measuring time by doctor's appointments. My hair grew back. It came in darker than before. Eventually, I stopped flinching every time I caught my reflection. I earned my certified Medicaid planner credential. Soon, I began managing my own clients. Families sat across from my desk during the hardest weeks of their lives. I discovered I was good at giving them exactly what they'd come looking for: steadiness. Margaret and I established a standing Thursday dinner every single week, no exceptions. It was the kind of dependable relationship I'd spent my entire life giving to other people, without ever receiving in return. For the first time, I learned what it felt like to be the person someone else drove home. With my biological family, I maintained only the thinnest possible connection: a birthday text to my mother, a thumbs-up reaction on a cousin's baby picture, nothing that required sitting around the same table. Every so often, my mother still posted pictures of the familiar blue Pyrex casserole dish in the family group chat, steam rising from another Sunday roast. Then one Thursday, I realized I'd scrolled right past the picture without feeling that familiar ache. The casserole dish that had once reminded me of the table I'd been quietly removed from now simply represented a meal in a house where I no longer needed a seat. That was how I knew I was finally free. Not because I'd stopped loving them, but because their definition of family had finally lost the power to hurt me. I truly believed that chapter of my life was over. I'd built something quiet, something solid, out of the wreckage they'd left behind. I expected everything from that point forward to remain exactly that way: distant, manageable, survivable. Then, on an ordinary Thursday evening, while I was chopping onions before Margaret came over for dinner, my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. Mom. I hadn't seen her name appear on my screen in months. For a moment, I almost didn't answer. I stood there holding the kitchen knife while the onions burned my eyes and the phone continued vibrating against the countertop. Then an old instinct, the same one that had shaped my entire childhood, made me pick up. Something was wrong from the very first word. Her voice sounded thin, frightened, slightly slurred. She told me she'd suffered a stroke 10 days earlier. 10 days. While I'd been living my quiet life only a couple of suburbs away. No one had thought to tell me. Later, I pieced together what had happened. Emily had informed the relatives that everything was under control. She'd asked everyone not to involve me until the family figured out what they actually needed, which was simply a polite way of saying, until they needed me. I'd also muted the family group chat months earlier. The few worried messages anyone posted had slipped past without me ever reading them. My mother's left side wasn't functioning properly. She couldn't manage the stairs, couldn't dress herself, couldn't safely stay alone for very long. She needed help, daily help, hands-on care for the foreseeable future. I leaned against the kitchen counter and quietly listened while she talked. Then I noticed something that continued bothering me for the rest of that night. She never once asked how I was doing. She didn't ask whether my scans were still clear. She didn't ask if the cancer she'd ignored had stayed gone. She never even acknowledged that the last truly important conversation we'd had was when I'd been fighting for my life, and she'd decided she didn't have room for it. In her mind, I'd simply been placed on a shelf for 2 years, waiting, available. Now she'd come back to take me down again. "You were always the strong one, Claire," she whispered through tears. "I need my strong girl now." I held the phone and felt the strangest sense of calm. The calm that comes when something arrives exactly when you always knew it would. Ever since the day I printed that quitclaim deed, I'd known this phone call was inevitable. The math had already guaranteed it. I just hadn't expected it to arrive wrapped inside my mother's fear, asking for my time, my body, my future, in almost exactly the same calm voice she'd once used to tell me she couldn't deal with my cancer. I told her I'd think about it. Then I called Margaret. The family machine went into motion almost immediately, the moment they smelled a solution. Emily called the very next morning. She sounded brisk, organized, like someone assigning household chores. It was obvious she'd already decided everything with my mother. She wasn't asking what I thought. She was informing me what my role would be. "You work from home half the week," she said. "You're single. You don't have kids. It just makes the most sense for you to move in with Mom." She presented it as simple logistics, as fairness, as the obvious arrangement any reasonable person would immediately recognize. When I calmly asked why she couldn't do it herself, she already had every answer prepared. She had Nathan. She had a baby. She had a life that couldn't simply be put on hold. Then she repeated the exact same sentence she'd written to me 2 years earlier, as though she'd never even heard herself say it before, as though it were a law of nature instead of a knife. "You don't have a family of your own to worry about. Claire," I let the silence stretch between us for a moment before speaking. "That's funny," I finally said. 2 years ago, I wasn't enough of a family member for anyone to visit me in the hospital. Now I'm enough of a family member to move into one." She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she shifted to the tactic she'd always been best at, making me the problem. An hour later, Aunt Linda called. In my family, Aunt Linda was the enforcer, the one who appeared whenever someone needed to remind you of your obligations in the solemn tone of a woman quoting scripture. "A good daughter shouldn't even have to be asked," she told me, and here's the part none of them ever mentioned, the part they assumed I still didn't know. Not one of them brought up the house. They were planning my mother's future care as though they still had plenty of options. None of them had the slightest idea I'd already read exactly what they'd done with every one of those options. I know some of you are probably talking back to your screen right now, telling me not to move into that house. Don't worry, but notice what I noticed. Not once did anyone ask if I was healthy. They asked if I was available. Those are not the same word. And the difference between them is this entire story. If your own family has ever confused those two things, leave a comment below, then stay with me, because we're about to get to the house, the deed, and the number no one in my family ever thought to calculate. The invitation arrived a few days later. It was almost too perfect. Emily was hosting a housewarming party. After 2 years, she and Nathan had finally finished renovating the house, and she wanted the entire family to come over, admire the place, and, according to her text, sit down together and figure out Mom. I read the message twice. The house she was so excited to show everyone, the house she'd renovated with such pride, was my childhood home, the same house my mother had signed over to her for $1 while I was bald, drowning in medical bills and begging the darkness for help. Now she wanted to gather the entire family inside that house so they could pressure me, the dependable daughter, to sacrifice my own life, caring for the woman who'd handed her the deed. They planned to do it in front of an audience. That's how my family always operated. A crowd makes it much easier to corner one person. My mother would be there in her wheelchair, the perfect picture of helplessness. Aunt Linda would be there to lecture everyone about duty. My cousins would nod along. And I had been invited to play my assigned role, the reliable daughter, the one who says okay in a perfectly normal voice, then quietly starts packing her bags. I sat there staring at the invitation and felt something settle inside me. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was the kind of clarity that only comes when a problem finally reveals its true shape. They thought they were going to use the house against me. What they didn't realize was that the house was about to speak for me. I texted back just 2 words, "I'll come." Then I opened my laptop, pulled up the county recorder's website one more time, verified that nothing had changed. After that, I called the one person who could explain exactly what that $1 deed had actually set in motion. The following morning, I laid everything out for Evelyn, professional to professional, exactly the way I would present any client file: mother, mid-60s, recent stroke, likely needs long-term nursing care. Primary residence transferred by quitclaim deed to her other daughter for $1, recorded 20 months ago. Evelyn didn't even bother reaching for a calculator. She'd seen this disaster too many times. "So the house is out of your mother's name," she said, and still well inside the 5-year look-back period. Together we worked through the numbers on the whiteboard. The home was worth roughly $340,000. Under Medicaid rules, you divide the value of the transferred asset by the state's penalty divisor, the average monthly cost of nursing home care the state uses to calculate ineligibility. That year, it was a little over $12,000 per month. $340,000 divided by approximately $12,000 equals about 28 months. Evelyn capped the marker. 28 months, she said, during which Medicaid won't pay a single dollar toward your mother's nursing home care because she gave away the very asset that should have been available to help cover those costs. I asked what options remained, because there are almost always a few. She nodded. They could pay privately. About $12,000 every month, money my mother didn't have anymore because she'd already given away the asset that represented most of her wealth. They could apply for an undue hardship waiver. She paused. Those are denied more often than not. Then she looked directly at me. And then there's the real solution. She didn't have to explain it. I already knew. Your sister can transfer the house back. In many situations, returning the property reverses the transfer and eliminates most of the Medicaid penalty. The exact outcome depends on state regulations, timing, and how far the application process has progressed. It isn't always as simple as signing one document, but the underlying truth remains the same. The person holding the asset is the only one capable of fixing the math. I wasn't planning to threaten anyone with that information. I didn't need to. I was simply going to be the only person at that housewarming party who actually understood what the deed meant. That evening, I called Margaret and told her everything: the invitation, the calculations, the 28-month penalty. She stayed quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the only question that truly mattered. What do you actually want, Claire? Not what would feel satisfying. Not what would make you win. What do you want? I thought about it honestly. I didn't want the house. Despite everything, I didn't want my mother to suffer either. That's simply not who I am. And I suspect most of you watching wouldn't want that either. What I wanted was to stop being my family's emergency fund made out of flesh and sacrifice. I wanted to speak the truth, out loud, in front of the very people who'd spent 2 years pretending that truth didn't exist. Then I wanted to drive home, back to the life I'd built without them. You don't owe them your body, Margaret said. She always had a way of making complicated things sound simple. You already gave them 2 years of silence while you lay on a bathroom floor. That debt has been paid in full. I told her I wasn't going there to punish anyone. I was going because I was finally done volunteering to be punished myself. She smiled. I like that. Then she gave me 3 pieces of advice. Wear something that makes you feel like yourself. Take your time. Leave the moment the conversation stops serving you. The following afternoon, before driving over, I carefully folded the teal blanket and placed it on the passenger seat of my car. It had ridden beside me to every chemotherapy treatment, covered my lap during the hardest nights, become the one soft thing I'd carried out of the most difficult year of my life. I wasn't planning to carry it into the party. It wasn't a prop. I simply wanted it waiting in the car. The way you keep one hand resting on something solid before walking into uncertain ground. That afternoon, I wasn't bringing just one version of myself into that house. I was bringing the survivor, the professional, the daughter they'd quietly written off, and the teal blanket. It simply reminded me that all of those women had survived together. The house looked smaller than I remembered, and far more expensive than it had any right to. Emily had done an impressive job renovating someone else's gift. New shutters, fresh landscaping. Through the front window, I could already see a completely remodeled kitchen. The kind of upgrades people make when they're absolutely certain a house belongs to them forever. Cars lined both sides of the street. Cousins, neighbors, the entire audience my family always preferred to perform in front of. I parked, left the teal blanket on the passenger seat, then walked up the same front path I'd traveled thousands of times as a child. The moment I stepped inside, I was greeted by warm air, the smell of food, and the familiar noise of too many people talking at once. There, displayed proudly on the beautiful new kitchen island, sat the old blue Pyrex casserole dish, the same chip dish filled with my mother's pot roast. Apparently, it had been passed down along with the house, the tradition inherited alongside the deed, the real family's casserole dish, sitting in the real family's kitchen. Several relatives noticed me immediately. They greeted me with that particular kind of forced kindness reserved for the unfortunate member of the family. One cousin asked whether work was going okay. An aunt told me I looked tired in our family. You look tired had always meant you look like you're struggling. They all believed they knew exactly who I still was. The unmarried daughter, the broke daughter, the dependable daughter, the one who would eventually say yes because, in their minds, what else could she possibly have going on? My mother sat near the center of the living room in her wheelchair. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. Standing directly behind her was Aunt Linda, positioned like a courtroom bailiff. Emily floated effortlessly through the house playing hostess, golden, confident, perfectly at home. They had staged everything exactly the way they'd wanted, the wheelchair, the crowd. The dutiful daughter arriving right on cue. Every single person inside that house believed they already knew what my answer would be. Not one of them had read the document I'd read. I accepted a glass of water, found an empty chair, and quietly waited for the performance to begin. They didn't keep me waiting long. After everyone finished eating and the plates had been cleared away, Aunt Linda tapped her glass with a spoon. The room immediately fell silent. Of course, this conversation was going to happen publicly. It had always been meant to happen publicly. She began warmly enough, talking about family, hard times, how whenever one member of the family falls, the rest of us carry them. Then she turned toward me. The warmth disappeared. We all know Karen needs care now, she said, and we all know who's in the best position to provide it. She looked directly at me. After everything your mother has done for you, Claire. The room answered with a low murmur of agreement, that soft approving sound crowds make when they believe they're witnessing virtue. My mother recognized her cue immediately. She dabbed delicately at her eyes with a tissue she'd clearly prepared ahead of time. I need you, sweetheart, she whispered. You're the only one strong enough, the only one who doesn't have a family depending on her." Emily stepped in from the kitchen doorway like an attorney delivering her closing argument. "We figured you'd move in by the end of the month," she said matter-of-factly. "It saves us from hiring someone, and it's not like you'd really have to give up much." I remained perfectly still. I let every word settle, the way you allow a wave to wash over you instead of fighting against it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. Over the previous 2 years, I'd learned something important. The calmest person in the room is usually the one holding the actual facts. For the first time in my life, that person was me. They surrounded me with carefully staged need. The wheelchair, the tissues, the gathered relatives, the blue casserole dish steaming proudly on the kitchen island. I waited until Aunt Linda looked directly at me and asked, in front of everyone, whether I intended to do my duty. Only then did I set down my glass of water, reach into my bag, and remove a single folded sheet of paper. No one in the room realized it yet. But the paperwork was finally about to speak. I unfolded the deed and laid it flat on the kitchen island, right beside the blue Pyrex casserole dish, where everyone could see it. "Before anyone decides who should move in with whom," I said calmly, "I think everyone deserves to be looking at the same facts." I rested one hand on the document. "This is a recorded property deed. It's public information. Anyone in this room could have looked it up. I simply happen to read documents like this for a living." Every eye stayed fixed on the paper. It shows that 20 months ago, 3 weeks before Emily's wedding, my mother transferred this house. I looked around the room. This very house we're all standing inside. To Emily, for $1, while I was receiving chemotherapy. The room became so quiet I could hear someone set down a fork. Emily's face changed. Shock. Embarrassment. "Something more complicated than either," I continued, speaking in exactly the same measured tone I used every day with clients sitting across my desk. "Now let's talk about what that means for Mom's long-term care, because this is my profession." I tapped the document lightly. When someone gives away their home within 5 years of needing nursing home care, the state counts that transfer. There's a 5-year look-back period and a financial penalty. I paused. "This house is worth approximately $340,000. I looked around the room again. "You divide that amount by the state's monthly penalty divisor, a little over $12,000, and you get approximately 28 months. No one interrupted. "For 28 months? Medicaid will not contribute a single penny toward my mother's nursing home care because the asset that should have been available to help pay for it is sitting underneath this kitchen." I let the silence linger. Aunt Linda's mouth had actually fallen open. "So someone," I continued quietly, "will either be paying approximately $12,000 every month out of pocket, or someone will need to transfer this house back to Mom in order to reverse the gift and eliminate most of the Medicaid penalty." Then I looked directly at Emily, and only one person has the ability to do that. I gently slid the deed a few inches across the countertop toward her. "This house isn't in my name." I looked at my mother. "It isn't in Mom's name anymore either." Then back to Emily. "It's in the name of the person hosting today's housewarming party. Not the daughter who was left alone during chemotherapy. The daughter who received the house." I kept my voice calm, almost gentle. "I'm not here to tell anyone what the law requires." I shook my head. "No one made you your mother's caregiver just because your name appears on a deed." I tapped the paper one final time. "I'm simply explaining who currently controls the only asset capable of fixing this situation." I met her eyes. "That isn't cruelty. That's just where the house ended up." The room reacted exactly the way rooms always do when the floor suddenly shifts beneath them. Emily was the first to raise her voice. "You just want the house back," she shouted. "You've always been jealous. That's what this is really about." I never took the bait. "I don't want the house, Emily," I answered quietly. "I just want you to understand what came along with accepting it." Nathan had gone completely pale, unlike his wife. He wasn't yelling, he was calculating. I could practically watch the numbers moving behind his eyes. $12,000 every month after pouring their savings into renovations. Slowly, he turned away from me and looked directly at my mother. Not Claire, not Emily, my mother. Karen, he said softly, his voice tight with disbelief. When you signed this house over, did you know any of this? There it was, the very first crack in the picture of the real family, the son-in-law turning toward the woman who had unknowingly handed him a poisoned gift. Cornered for the first time in years. My mother did the only thing she'd ever truly known how to do. She cried harder. When the tears failed to move me, she abandoned them and turned to anger. How could you? She demanded, glaring at me. How could you? She demanded. How could you humiliate me like this, in front of everyone, after everything I did raising you? For just a second, as I looked at her sitting there, small, frightened, and fragile in that wheelchair, I felt it, that instinctive pull of compassion, an elderly woman terrified of what was coming. I let myself feel it. Because I'm not a monster, and I don't think you are either. I just wanted to keep the house in the family, she whispered, for the grandchildren. Maybe she even believed that. Maybe it was partly true, but notice what she still didn't say. She never apologized, even now, sitting in the kitchen she'd given away, surrounded by the consequences of her own choices. She never apologized to the daughter she'd left bald, broke, alone. Instead, she reached for blame, for self-pity, for the same quiet expectation that I'd once again absorbed the cost of decisions she'd made. The sympathy passed through me and kept going. She was still a human being. She was also still wrong. The room remained silent. That's the strange thing about a crowd gathered to corner one person. It doesn't scatter just because the script changes. It simply stays to watch the new ending. Finally, my mother composed herself. Then she asked the question she'd invited me there to answer. The question the wheelchair, the tissues, the casserole dish. The entire afternoon had been carefully arranged around. So you'll come take care of me, she said. You'll move in. I need you. Claire. I looked at her for a long time, the woman who, 2 years earlier, had answered her daughter's cancer diagnosis by deciding a wedding mattered more. To my own surprise, I wasn't angry anymore. That was the strange gift hidden inside all those years. I simply felt clear. Completely clear. I remembered the exact words she'd spoken to me over the phone 2 years before, the words I'd carried inside me like a stone in my shoe ever since. We can't deal with this right now. Then I handed them back, trimmed down to the only 4 words that truly mattered, in the same calm voice she'd once used with me. I can't either. The sentence settled into the middle of the room. No one moved. No one breathed. Aunt Linda froze with her glass halfway to her lips. Emily's face drained of color. My mother stared at me as though I'd begun speaking another language. Maybe I had. The language of a no she'd never imagined I would learn. Talk to the new owner, I added quietly. I nodded toward my sister, toward the woman whose name appeared on the deed. In the very house where the pot roast still steamed beside us, I wasn't cruel. There was no reason to be. The facts were already doing all the work. I'd learned long ago that the calmest person in the room never needs to raise her voice. I stood, picked up my bag, slipped the folded deed back inside, left my untouched glass of water on the table, and nothing else. I didn't slam a door. I simply walked through the living room, past cousins who'd arrived expecting to watch responsibility assigned, only to watch it returned instead, past the old blue Pyrex casserole dish slowly cooling on the kitchen island, past the front door I'd walked through thousands of times as a child. Aunt Linda hurried after me, catching up just as I reached the front walkway. Out of breath, she played the final card my family had always relied on. "But she's your mother," she pleaded. "This is family." I stopped, turned around, looked directly at her. "Family doesn't send you a bill for the years you survived alone," I said. Then I got into my car. The teal blanket was exactly where I'd left it, folded neatly on the passenger seat, soft, worn, entirely mine, the one thing that had remained beside me through the hardest season of my life. I rested my hand on it for a moment, the way you touch something solid just to remind yourself you're still standing. Then I started the engine, pulled away from the house my mother had given away for $1, and never looked in the rearview mirror because there was nothing behind me I needed to see ever again. I'd walked into that house carrying myself. I walked back out carrying myself too. For the first time in my life, leaving my family behind didn't feel like losing them. It felt like finally being allowed to keep myself. So here's what happened afterward, because I know you're wondering. The math didn't care about anyone's feelings, and the math had backed them into a corner. After several weeks of panic and a consultation with an experienced elder law attorney, Emily and Nathan did the only sensible thing left. They transferred the house back to my mother. Their attorney explained that returning the property eliminated most of the Medicaid penalty. It also destroyed the fairy tale they'd been living, the one where that house had ever truly belonged to them. After that, they had no choice but to arrange my mother's care the same way every other family does, by hiring professional caregivers, by sharing the financial responsibility, by allowing the burden to fall where the asset had fallen. Nathan, I later heard, barely spoke to my mother for quite some time. He understood that her gift had nearly destroyed their financial future. Aunt Linda became remarkably quiet. A few of my cousins reached out privately. They admitted they hadn't known about the deed. They told me what had been done to me wasn't right. I appreciated those messages far more than I expected. I never celebrated. Never posted about any of it online. I simply returned to the life I'd built from the wreckage they had left behind. Margaret and I kept our Thursday dinners. My real family, the one I found in a chemotherapy chair instead of a family tree. I accepted more clients, became even better at the part of my job that mattered most, sitting beside people during the hardest week of their lives, helping impossible numbers finally make sense. I never completely cut my mother out of my life. That's not the kind of person I want to become. But I never moved into that house. I never became the unpaid caregiver she'd always assumed she could claim. And I stopped pretending our relationship was anything more than it actually was. I still mail my mother a birthday card every year. I just stopped mailing pieces of myself along with it. As it turns out, that's the difference between love and a debt someone else decides you owe. If I can leave you with one thing, let it be this: love is something freely given. It is never a debt someone has the right to collect from your body, your time, or your life. And the people who only remember your family when they need something have already told you exactly where you stand. Believe them the first time. It will save you the 2 years it took me to finally believe them myself. That's my story. A house transferred for $1, a teal blanket from strangers, and 4 words it took me 2 years to earn. If this story reminded you that being available is not the same thing as being loved, take that as your reminder to protect your own peace. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.